In the previous video, you saw that the standard Counter-Reformation eschatology interprets Revelation chapter 15 as John writing an entire chapter about 7 pagan Greek Nikes, invisibly flying around in heaven, and despite the fact that they are totally invisible to earth, Counter-Reformation eschatology wants its audiences to believe John writes that this totally unseen event would be a mega sign for his prophecies. You also saw that they totally ignore John's astronomical references in the text, and the actual occurrence of this mega sign in history, in order to avoid its connection to the historical timeline, which would definitively prove that the Antichrist, 666, the mark, the fire from heaven, and the image of the beast, have all already come in history. And that we are currently, actively and really in, the fourth bowl judgment, in history. You also saw in the previous video, John uses his prophetic material in chapter 15, to bookend his coming prophecies concerning the bowl judgments, in chapter 16. We also covered the fact that there were relatively few translation issues present in the text, in chapter 15. But as you are about to see, that situation will be quite a contrast to what we will find in the translation work concerning chapter 16. And as always, throughout the entire book, Counter-Reformation eschatology will intentionally depend extensively on that same bad translation work in English to promote its doctrines to the public. Knowing all along, those same words they are actually citing from those English translations are in fact fraudulent misrepresentations of the actual text. In this video, we will cover the translation work of Revelation chapter 16. And as you will see, there are multiple sections of text that appear to have been intentionally misrepresented to the public. And these textual misrepresentations, distortions, omissions and obfuscations substantially affect how the text is read by the public. You will see that if you open your English King James Bible and start reading, thinking you are reading what actually exists in the underlying Greek text, you will be totally deceived about what John really prophesied in 95 AD. Because the King James Version, along with many other versions, will not adequately, or sometimes even accurately, reflect what he actually wrote. And the difference between what was actually written and what ended up in our translations is so profound in some cases, it simply cannot be the result of mere incompetence or accident by the church board, translators, responsible for intentionally selecting those words.
Intensive, auch durchaus lange, aber erfolgreiche Beratungen. Erst im Kreis der 27 Mitgliedstaaten, dann unter den 17 Euro-Ländern. Mir ist, und ich glaube, das ging jedem so, sehr bewusst, dass die Welt heute auf diese Beratungen geschaut hat, dass die Welt sehen möchte, wie wir uns in unserer tiefen europäischen Krise bewähren. Und ich glaube, dass wir Europäer heute Nacht gezeigt haben, dass wir die richtigen Schlüsse gezogen haben. Wir haben die Ursachen der Krise erkannt, benannt und die Probleme auch wieder einen Schritt weit einer Lösung zugeführt. Wir haben einerseits über kurzfristig notwendige Schritte gesprochen, aber auch über langfristige Reformen, die vor allen Dingen damit zu tun haben, die europäischen Institutionen zu verbessern, die Zusammenarbeit insbesondere in der Eurozone zu verbessern. Ich habe heute im Bundestag gesagt, besser gesagt, ich habe gestern im Bundestag gesagt, Europa soll, so wie Deutschland es geschafft hat, stärker aus der Krise wieder herauskommen, als es hineingegangen ist. Das ist auch der Leitgedanke, der mich heute bei den Beratungen angespornt hat. Das muss unser Anspruch sein. Und ich glaube, das war auch der Anspruch von jedem, der an diesen Beratungen teilgenommen hat. Wir haben uns auf ein Gesamtpaket geeinigt, das aus 5 Elementen besteht. Erstens Eigenanstrengungen der Mitgliedstaaten. Zweitens eine nachhaltige Lösung für Griechenland. Drittens Optimierung der EFSF. Viertens Bankenrekapitalisierung. Und fünftens Stärkung des Stabilitätsrahmens für die Eurozone. Was die Eigenanstrengungen der Mitgliedstaaten anbelangt, so haben Spanien und Italien zusätzliche Reformschritte angekündigt. Spanien die Verpflichtung auf ambitionierte Haushaltsziele, die Schuldenregel, die sie an die Verfassung aufgenommen hat, auch operativ zu machen, Reformen gegen die sehr hohe Arbeitslosigkeit und die Stärkung der Wettbewerbsfähigkeit im Dienstleistungssektor. Italien auch die Reform der Arbeitsgesetzgebung, Stärkung der Wettbewerbsfähigkeit, auch bei Dienstleistungen und freien Berufen, Stärkung der kleinen und mittleren Unternehmen, eine Rentenreform und Ausarbeitung eines Plans der Haushaltskonsolidierung. Hier war besonders wichtig, dass Italien sich verpflichtet hat, seinen Schuldenstand bis 2014 auf 113% zu senken. Das ist eine bemerkenswerte Senkung und ich glaube, das wird eine wichtige Botschaft sein. Wir haben für eine nachhaltige Lösung Griechenlands natürlich uns heute eingesetzt. Die hat 3 Elemente. Es wird ein neues Griechenland-Programm geben. Angesichts veränderter Daten in Bezug auf niedrigeres Wirtschaftswachstum und langsamer fließende Privatisierungserlöse bleiben die Haushaltsziele natürlich anspruchsvoll, aber es sind jetzt realistischere Annahmen durch die Analyse der Troika gemacht worden und auf der Basis dieser neuen Annahmen ist ja auch dann das...
Ja, vielen Dank. Gute Nacht.
Gute Nacht.
You cannot know what John actually prophesied in 95 AD if the text you are reading is not what he wrote. Anytime you read a translation, you are reading the words of an interpreter. The interpreter has to be motivated to want to accurately reproduce what is spoken in the foreign language. The problem with most translation work is that accuracy in reproducing the original language text is not the top priority in most translation works that are provided to the public. Unfortunately, what has been the most common motivation in providing translations to the public by the government state churches of Europe has been to be in control of what the public was reading. So that what the public was reading was not a threat to their national security because they were church-state governments, where there was no separation between church and state. Something that threatened the Church of England also threatened the national security of England because England had made its church and state the same. So naturally, this greatly harmed society's real freedom to pursue the unvarnished truth in any matters affecting the church. The end result was both a corrupt church and a weakened state. Not to mention what it did to translations of the Bible, which in the end often emerged not much better than common government propaganda. In the end, the Church of England simply repeated all the same errors as the Church of Rome, and neither could bring themselves to produce an honest translation of the New Testament, especially when it came to the book of Revelation, which openly condemned them both. That history is why we have to re-examine the accuracy of our texts in English whenever there is a discussion of any doctrinal question or any prophetic material out of the book of Revelation, because there is very little guarantee that what you are reading in English is even remotely there in the Greek text. It might be there, but then again, it might not. It is really a toss of the dice. You never know what's really there until you actually spend the time and trouble to actually look at it and compare it with what has been translated. So it is a very important step in the process of doing either doctrinal studies or studying prophecy in Revelation that you simply cannot ever skip. Unless you simply do not care whether what you think is a prophecy is even really there in the text, the way you think it is. Precisely, as most counter-reformationist eschatology preachers actually prove they do not, over and over again. And that is why they never include this step in any of their studies. To understand how our most common translations get so screwed up, you have to understand the concept of theological evasion. Theological evasion is a term that describes institutional behavior that protects its theology by evading conflicts by contorting language in such a way that the conflict is simply removed. It is a form of circular reasoning that justifies linguistic distortions in the translation of sacred texts. If you begin with the assumption that whatever your church believes is true and right, no matter what it is, then it makes perfect sense that no text could ever contradict it, no matter what it appears to say. So, stretching, pushing and pulling the words of the text, and their definitions, to get them to reflect your church's theology in the translation, is seen as perfectly reasonable and legitimate. Rather than, as simply corrupting the text, which in reality, is what it actually is. Theological evasion, consequently, is a form of circular reasoning used by counter-reformationists, which also has led to much corruption, in certain parts, of the translation, of the New Testament, such as is seen throughout the book of Revelation. Theological evasion is a deadly virus to good translation work. Theological evasion will cause translators to perform all kinds of mental gymnastic tricks with the texts that they are translating. And it always ends up completely distorting texts beyond recognition, which is the whole point of it, to begin with. When theological evasion wants to mask over a text, it will do that by doing two things. The first change it will introduce are changes in the actual meaning of the words. It will accomplish changes in word meanings through four basic very frequently used techniques. The first, and by far the most frequently used trick, is to selectively use minor, secondary and tertiary definitions out of the Greek lexicon for a word. Most words have more than one meaning. And occasionally, a word is clearly used in a way that a minor tertiary definition is clearly the one intended. But when theological evasion is involved in translating a text, it will select the secondary or tertiary definition when it is clearly not the intended meaning, precisely so that the intended meaning will not become evident. And what you see when that happens is that while a minor secondary or tertiary definition may be occasionally used, they will use them the majority of the time, as though they were the majority use of the term. And that is what gives it away, as a mask. Because they are found to be consistently avoiding the primary definition of the word, and ignoring how it is intentionally used by the same author in other texts. That is a red flag, that their use of the tertiary definition is simply being used as a mask for theological evasion. If you have seen any of our previous videos on translation, you are already familiar with the format. But we will go over it again, for those who have recently joined and following the series. We will break the text down into three different sections. The first section of the text is what is referred to as the interlinear text. It is the Textus Receptus Greek text, with the literal English word underneath the Greek text. It is shown side by side, and that is why it is called an interlinear text. The second section of text is the standard King James English translation. That is the most common and widespread English translation in the world. And many other translations are simply variations on the King James translation. Words or phrases in the King James translation which conflict with the interlinear text, and are in need of a correction, will be highlighted in red. We will begin each translation by reading its translation in the King James Version, and then noting the differences between the KJV and the interlinear. We will highlight words and terms that need correction in red, so they can be easily seen. Some words and terms, however, do not necessarily need to be corrected, so much as they may need to be clarified by additional information, or simply improved. We will highlight those words and terms in purple, to show the distinction. After examining the differences presented in the Greek text, we will show what a corrected retranslation would look like, in the text below. We will keep track of our corrections and tally them at the end of the translation process, to see how significantly these corrections affected what we were reading in English. And then the third section of text, shown at the bottom, is our retranslation of the Textus Receptus into our modern English, for the purpose of this study in the book of Revelation. We will try to retain as much information as we can in our translation, and be as accurate to the Greek text as we can, in order to understand the specifics of John's prophecies. We will begin our translation work with verse 1, which reads as follows in the King James Version, quote, "And I heard a great voice out of the temple saying to the seven angels, Go your ways, and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth." End quote. As you can see from the text on your screen, we have four words that are in need of correction in the English translation. The first term is the word temple. As you can see from the Greek lexicon, The Greek term can mean a fane, shrine or temple, but it actually means, in its primary definition, a dwelling. Which puts the emphasis of the word on the fact that something is dwelling there, not the type of shell that is around it. If we restrict ourselves to the word temple, when that is not what John said, we might end up looking in the wrong place. So that is an important correction to make. The next word in our English text that needs correction is the English word angel. The English term angel is simply a transliteration of the Greek term angelos. But the term means messenger. The application of transliteration to that word is a misappropriate use of transliteration, and it should have been translated as messenger. We have discussed the theological significance, and why it was done, of that substitution numerous times already previously, so we will not cover it again. The third correction that needs to be made in our English text is the English word vials. We covered previously how this was an accurate translation when it was first made, but because of how the English term vial developed in our common usage, it is now a completely misleading and inaccurate term, which should be more accurately replaced with the term saucer, which we will do in our retranslation. And the fourth term, which needs to be corrected in our English text, is the term earth. As we have also covered numerous times, the Greek word used there is the Greek word gay, and means soil, as in the word land only. It makes no reference to the planet Earth, as the term is understood today. That is an inappropriate anachronistic use of the term. So we will correct that term in our retranslation, and redefine it as the word land, the way it was originally used in the text. And that completes our corrections. And our retranslation of the Textus Receptus reads as follows, quote, "And I heard a great sound out of the dwelling, saying to the 7 messengers, Go and pour out the saucers of the wrath of God into the land." End quote. Next we will translate verse 2. Verse 2 reads in the King James Version as follows, quote, "And the first went, and poured out his vial upon the earth. And there fell a noisome and grievous sore upon the men which had the mark of the beast, and upon them which worshipped his image." End quote. There are 5 corrections, and 1 improvement, that need to be made in the standard English text translation. The first correction is the word vial, which we have just covered. The second correction is the word earth again, which we have also already just covered. The third correction is the word noisome, which makes no sense, and is not even the definition of the word. The definition of this Greek term, kakos, is the word worthless. So we will change that back to the translation of the word worthless. The fourth correction is the word grievous, which should be translated as the word hurtful. The fifth correction, which is an improvement rather than a correction, is the KJV translation of the word proskuniho into the word worship. This translation into the English word worship is not simply wrong, as the other corrections are, but we are going to use the primary definition of the word, which means to kiss. Because the image of the beast, which is actually the word icon, as you will see in a moment, is literally kissed. And that is something you can physically see being done. By translating the term proskuniho into the word worship, it makes this event harder to see. Because a lot of people do not even know what the word worship even means. So they will deny worshiping an icon. But they will not deny kissing it. And the actual word there is to kiss. The word worship is a translated meaning, or rather, an implied meaning, by way of translation, but it is not the actual word that John wrote. So if you are kissing an icon, then you are doing precisely what John prophesied, whether you think you are worshiping it or not. Semantics over the word worship are actually irrelevant to John's prophecy. He wrote the word to kiss, not the English word worship. And everyone can clearly see a kiss, and obviously know what a kiss is, even if we don't really want to see it. So we will strip the veneer of ambiguity off that translation and put the actual meaning of the word proskuniho, which means to kiss, back into the text. In the last correction, as just mentioned, is the Greek word icon, which is literally the word icon. A term we still have in our vocabulary, which comes directly from this Greek term. So there would be absolutely no point in translating it into something else other than icon, unless we simply wanted to obscure what John wrote in the text, as is the goal of counter-reformationists concerning the content of this book. After these lexicon corrections, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "And away went the first, and poured his saucer upon the land, and it caused a worthless and painful ulcer or sore upon those who held to the mark of the beast, and kissed his icon." End quote. If you notice in this text, John says those who kiss the icon and hold to the mark. The expression, hold to the mark, is a broader expression than simply take the mark. Hold to the mark means to subscribe to its validity, irregardless of whether or not you have actually taken it. As we have pointed out in the language of previous texts, especially in chapter 13, John makes it clear, not everyone is taking the mark he is including in his condemnations. The mark was only one of 3 identifications given. It was only 1/3 of his identifiers. We see this language again in verse 2. He is including all those who hold to its validity, not simply take it. Verse 3 in the King James Version reads as follows, quote, "And the second angel poured out his vial upon the sea. And it became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea." End quote. In verse 3, we have 4 lexicon corrections, and 1 improvement to make. The first correction we see is in the unnecessary transliteration of the Greek word angelos into the English term angel. As noted numerous times before, this word is the Greek word for messenger, which we will correct in our translation back to its intended meaning. The next correction is in the English word vial, again, which we have covered already as well. Our modern English word vial refers to a glass bottle for holding medicine, whereas the original word referred to a saucer-shaped bowl, or to what we would now call a saucer. The next correction is an improvement or clarification. It is not actually translated wrong, but the way it is translated creates an ambiguity in the language, which needs to be removed. The phrase is highlighted in purple and reads as, quote, "as the blood of," end quote. The sentence being it becomes "as the blood of." The phrase was intended to convey a sense of likeness in appearance. But the English translation, "as the blood of," can convey ambiguity, meaning it can also be read as, becomes, the blood itself. And that is not what the text is saying, so the English translation creates a false impression. The text says, "the water became like blood," or blood-like, not blood itself. The appearance was like blood. So we are going to improve the translation, "as the blood of," to the shortened and more specific phrase, "blood-like." This is a hugely important detail to note, because if you are looking for literal actual blood, you will ignore everything that looks like it. And that is precisely what Counter-Reformation eschatology uses the ambiguously bad translation to teach people to do. They also accomplish hiding the fulfillment of that prophecy in the process. So we will strip the veneer of ambiguity off the text once again, by clarifying the language in our retranslation. The next correction in translation is another example of misleading language that Counter-Reformation eschatology intentionally cites to mislead people. It is found in the Koine Greek word, pas, translated as the word, every. As in the English, quantitative reference, every single one. But as you see from the lexicon, pas, in Koine Greek, also had a qualitative reference, which referred to kind, not number. As in our phrase, every kind of, meaning the full spectrum, of every type, or every class, or, in other words, every kind of. We have covered this issue before in chapter 13, where the qualitative use is seen also. And we have covered the fact that almost all uses of this Greek word in the New Testament, by a vast majority, were of the qualitative reference, not the quantitative reference. In fact, you couldn't even read the texts in their normal proper context, if you didn't understand them to be referring to the qualitative, not the quantitative reference. Such as the love of money is the root of all evil. Which obviously is not true, in the quantitative sense. There was no money, in the Garden of Eden. We will correct this mistaken quantitative reference in English, to the Koine Greek, qualitative reference, in our retranslation. The last correction that is needed in our English translation, is the translation of the Greek word, psyche, into our English word, soul. The etymology of the English word, soul, comes from Old English sawal, from Proto-Germanic sawalo, which is the source also, of Old Saxon schola, Old Norse sala, Old Frisian seli, Middle Dutch seal, Dutch zeal, from Old High German sula, from German, seal, ultimately from Gothic, saiwala, and in the end, of uncertain origin. Or in other words, nobody really knows. So we are using a term in English, that nobody has any clue, where it came from. To translate the Greek term, psyche, and soul, has a lot of different meanings. But originally meant, from the lake, because that is where Northern Europeans who introduced this term, thought souls came from, or went ultimately, when they died. Which is a pretty bizarre notion. Until you remember they used to bury them in the lake, by sending them off to sink in the middle of one, on a burning boat. As everyone has seen dramatized, in the Viking burial scenes, on TV, in the movies. So they associated the soul, the immaterial part of people, with the lake, where they buried them. The English word, soul, is used 39 times in the New Testament, for the Greek word psyche. But the problem is, that these two terms, do not really equate to each other, across the board, the way it is used in our English translations. Sometimes the English word soul is used to refer to the word spirit, which is a different Greek word, pneuma. And sometimes it is used to refer to the literal breath. So the English word, soul, is used in a very sloppy catch-all manner. But, the Greek word, psyche, literally means, breath. The problem however, is that, psyche, by way of implication only, means, something similar, to the English word, soul. Theologically speaking, in numerous theologies, there are things which can have breath, but do not have souls. Whereas, there is nothing that has breath, that does not have the Greek word, psyche, because psyche, actually literally means breath. If it is breathing, then it obviously, has breath, meaning it does have the Greek word, psyche. A frog, or even a snake, has psyche. Because breath and psyche, are one and the same. However, frogs and snakes do not have pneuma, meaning spirit. Since soul is used to refer to either one in our translation, we have no idea, what the original writers were referring to in the Greek, by the use of the English term, soul. The Koine Greek term, psyche, is actually closer to our modern English term, psyche, because that is actually where that modern English term comes from. But even there, we do not have the literal connection to the word, breath, that existed in the Greek term, psyche. When you translate the Greek term for breath, as the English word, soul, in verse 3, you create the theology, that fish have eternal souls. Because that is what the text then reads. Which would be a fine translation, if that is what John intended to say in his reference. But John was not giving a dissertation on the souls of dolphins. He was stating that this plague would kill every kind of living thing, in the sea. It would be a devastating plague, to marine life, of all kind. So we will remove that Old English, translation term, soul, from the sentence, and restore the literal meaning of the Greek text, which was, the word breath. And then the sentence, will state exactly what it said in Greek. Not our mistranslation of what we think it meant, based on Old English, from Saxon, from Norse, from Dutch, from German, from Gothic, from who knows where. And when we restore the primary meaning of the Greek word, psyche, which means, breath, this is what our retranslation looks like. Quote, "And the second messenger poured his saucer into the sea and caused it to become blood-like, and all manner of breathing life died in the sea." End quote. Now, you can see what John actually wrote in this text. But as you can also see, it looks quite a bit different than what you saw in the raw King James Version text, with all its Old English equations, and absolute quantitative references using the Greek word, pos. Now we are looking at something that causes the sea to look like blood, and that kills every type of marine life exposed to it. When we see this happening, we will know the second saucer judgment has been poured out. Verse 4, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "And the third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood." End quote. There are two corrections and one improvement or clarification in verse 4. The first correction is the erroneous transliteration of angelos again, which means messenger. The second correction is the term vial, again, also previously covered, which means saucer. And the third is the improvement or clarification on the phrase, became blood. That is the Greek word, ginome, and as you see in the lexicon definition, it is used with great latitude, which includes its use, figuratively. And we have a figurative use here. How do we know that? Because verse 4 is simply a repeat of verse 3, as applied to freshwater sources. And John has already made it clear in the language of verse 3, he was describing the likeness of an appearance, not literal blood. So his repeat use here, using the Greek word, ginome, is the figurative use, which we will notate in our translation by using the word, like, in brackets, to indicate his figurative use of the Greek word, ginome. After we make these corrections, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "And the third messenger poured out his saucer into the rivers and founts of water, and they became blood-like." End quote. Once again, you can see with a few simple corrections, we have vastly improved how this text reads. Instead of looking for giant pagan Greek nikes flying around in the sky, and literal oceans, and literal rivers of actual, literal, human blood, we are looking at astronomical events, precipitating an ocean water plague, and a freshwater plague, wherein the water becomes blood-like, and kills all manner of marine life. Now that we are reading what John actually wrote, straight from the Textus Receptus, instead of what King James wrote for the Church of England, we are now empowered to see this prophecy's real fulfillment, in real history. Verse 5, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "And I heard the angel of the waters say, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art, and wast, and shalt be, because thou hast judged thus." End quote. In verse 5, we do not have much, in the way, that will affect any of John's prophetic material, which we are trying to uncover, but we do have a rather amazingly blatant example of theological evasion tactics, used in the translation of this verse, as you will see in just a minute. In verse 5, we have two corrections, and one clarification or improvement, we will make in our retranslation. The first correction is, once again, the transliteration of the term angelos, which means messenger, not pagan Greek Nike. Then we come to our clarification or improvement, in the translation of the English term, Lord. Some of the English words, used in our English translations, are pretty strange. This is another strange one. The English term, Lord, comes from its use to refer to feudal lords. It literally means, one who guards the loaves, or the bread keeper. Obviously, John never addressed God as the chief bread keeper. So why are we using that word? The term, Lord, is being used to translate the Greek word, kurios. But as you will find in a Google search, the Greek term kurios was simply the New Testament reference to the Hebrew sacred name, Yahweh. So the English title, Lord, as in a feudal lord, meaning chief bread keeper, is rather an odd substitution, there. So we will improve that by simply carrying the sacred name into our retranslation of the text, to better reflect what John was making a cultural reference to. And the final correction, we have counted as one, but it is actually 3. And it is a pretty big correction. And it has 6 mistakes in it. The first mistake, made 3 times, is that the definite article is in the Greek, as you can clearly see, pointed out to you on the screen. That is a big deal, because presence of the definite article indicates singularity. The text should be saying, the one who is, the one who was, the one holy. But as you can see in the English King James Version, there is no hint of the definite article whatsoever. And the second mistake that is made is that, next to those definite articles, which are completely absent in our English translation, the three words that are used next to those definite articles are all singular in number, to match the use of the definite article. Once again, indicating the one who is, the one who was, and the one who is holy. As you can see on your screen, these are all in the singular number, indicated by the letter S in the Robinson Morphological Analysis Code. The Lexham Bible translation translates this text as follows, quote, "You are righteous, the one who is, and the one who was, the Holy One." End quote. So why did the King James translators mangle this text beyond recognition? It was theological evasion, because the way John had written it was a direct refutation of the Trinity doctrine held by the Church of England, instituted by the Edict of Thessalonica, by the Roman Catholic Church, as its substitute doctrine of God, to replace the Shema that Christ had actually taught to his disciples, and had called the greatest commandment of all. So, in order to avoid the conflict in the text, they simply mangled, beyond recognition, the grammatical construction of how it was written. Problem solved. When we make these corrections, our retranslation of the Textus Receptus reads as follows, quote, "And I heard the messenger of the waters saying, You are just, Yahweh, the one who is, and the one who was, and the one who is holy, because you have judged these things." End quote. Verse 6, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "For they have shed the blood of saints and prophets, and thou hast given them blood to drink, for they are worthy." End quote. There are three corrections in verse 6. The first correction is the Greek word, ekskyle, translated as the word, shed, but which means to pour. The second correction is the Greek word, hagios, translated saints, but which means, sacred or holy. The third correction is the Greek word, axios, which means, deserving. After we make these corrections, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "Because they have poured out the blood of the holy ones, and prophets, you have given them blood to drink, for they deserve it." End quote. Verse 7, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "And I heard another out of the altar say, Even so, Lord God Almighty, true and righteous are thy judgments." End quote. In verse 7, we have three improvements or clarifications, and one correction. The first word, which we previously discussed, is the use of the English word, Lord, to translate the Greek word kurios. The Greek word, kurios, according to Strong's lexicon, means supreme, and by way of implication, something similar to the title, Mr. But the attribution of this definition, by way of implication only, is very questionable, because it was a Greek term, to that effect, in its original usage. It wasn't just an implied meaning. In fact, the term is still used in Greek to this very day. And if you type in, Mr. Jones, into Google Translate, it will actually translate that into kurios zoans, which is Greek for, Mr. Jones. So the definition of the term kurios, as Mr., is more than an implication. But that's not the whole story, concerning the use of the Greek word, kurios. It was used approximately 7,000 times in the Greek Septuagint, in place of the Hebrew Tetragrammaton. The reason this was done was during the time the Septuagint was translated, the cultural custom of replacing the sacred name of God with euphemisms, such as Hashem, were in effect. So, in keeping with Jewish custom, rather than copy the sacred name from the Hebrew text, into the Greek Septuagint text, they simply replace the tetragrammaton with the Greek word kurios as a substitutionary euphemism, like the phrase Hashem, aka the name. As mentioned earlier, the English title, Lord, means chief bread keeper, and we know John was not addressing God as the chief bread keeper. So we will be replacing that word, in our retranslation, with what John was actually making reference to by way of these terms. We will make the correction, and show the actual tetragrammaton, that the Greek euphemism, kurios, was being used to refer to, in our retranslation. The next two words, are two more improvements or clarifications, that kind of go with this same issue. It is translated into English as the phrase, God Almighty. In the Textus Receptus Greek, the phrase appears in the grammatical construction of the text as, the God, the Almighty. This was the Septuagint form, of the Hebrew descriptive name, El Shaddai. This is reflected directly, in the TS 2009 software translation, as you see on your screen, which we will do also in our retranslation, as well. In the last word, which is our correction, is the King James translation of the word, righteous, from the Greek word dikaios, which means equitable. The word, just, is used in the interlinear, which is basically a synonym for equitable. But dikaios, literally means equitable, so that is what we will use in our retranslation. After we make those corrections, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "And I heard another out of the altar saying, Yes, Yahweh, El Shaddai, true and equitable are your judgments." End quote. Verse 8, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "And the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire." End quote. We have 4 corrections to make in verse 8. The first correction is the continued unnecessary transliteration of the Greek word angelos, which means messenger. The second correction is fixing the anachronism of the modern definition of the word, vial, which is a glass bottle for medicine, and which has changed from its original meaning, restoring it back to what it originally meant, as the word, saucer. The third correction is the insertion of the word, power, into the text, out of thin air, which we will remove. And the fourth correction is the word, scourge, to translate the Greek word, kaumatizo, which means to burn, which by way of notation, comes from the root word, kauma, which means to glow, as in, by way of heat. After we make these corrections, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "And the fourth messenger poured his saucer upon the sun, and gave him, or it, to burn the men in fire, or heat." End quote. Verse 9, in the King James Version, reads as follows, quote, "And men were scorched with great heat, and blasphemed the name of God, which hath power over these plagues, and they repented not to give him glory." End quote. In verse 9, we have 2 corrections and 2 clarifications or improvements. The first word is a correction, and is once again, the Greek word, kaumatizo, which is translated into English as the word, scorch, but is actually the word, burn. The second word is a clarification, and concerns the phrase, the name, as in the section of text, the name of God. The reason there is a needed clarification, is because this phrase, the name, was a cultural idiomatic expression, which we have repeatedly discussed, already. In Hebrew, it is pronounced, Hashem, which literally means, the name. But it was a euphemistic expression that stood in the place of the tetragrammaton. So, in our retranslation, we are going to clarify, that was John's actual reference. So this is not technically a translation correction, so much as it is, a needed clarification. Our next word or phrase, is directly connected to the same translation issue. It is the rest of the same translation phrase, concerning the next 2 words, translated as, of God. The first phrase, the name, is actually Hashem. The second phrase, which is stated in Greek as to Theotu, which by itself translates into the phrase, of his God, but which was actually the reference to the sacred name itself, in Greek. So while it is once again translated technically correct, the idiomatic expression being used needs to be clarified for English-speaking audiences, which we will do in our retranslation. The fourth word is actually a lexicon correction. It is translated as the English word, repent. But is the Greek word, metanoisan, and in Koine Greek, simply meant to change your mind. So we will restore the primary definition back to its original form in our retranslation. After these corrections, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "And men were burned with great heat, and blasphemed Hashem, Yahweh, who held power over their plague, yet no thought was given to his glory." End quote. With those corrections, you are reading a much more literal translation of what John was actually communicating to his original audience. And as you see, along with his prophecies of these events, he also prophesied, despite these prophesied events, there would be no change in their thinking, away from their blasphemy. Verse 10 reads as follows in the King James Version, quote, "And the fifth angel poured out his vial upon the seat of the beast, and his kingdom was full of darkness, and they gnawed their tongues for pain." End quote. There is a lot to unpack in verse 10. There are 6 to 7 corrections to make in verse 10, depending on how you count it. The first correction is the standard correction of the transliteration of angelos, again, back into messenger. The second correction is the word vial, back into the word saucer. The third correction is the word seat, from the Greek word, thonos, back into the word throne, which is where the English word throne comes from. The fourth correction is the insertion of the additional words, full of. There is nothing in the text that states that. The second part of the fourth correction, or the fifth correction, depending on how you prefer to count it, is the word darkness. And this is where the language in this text begins to get complex. The Greek word, skato, from which the English word darkness was translated, doesn't mean darkness. It means obscure. But the story about the meaning of this word gets complicated. In a translation, however, we want the meaning of the word. And the meaning of the word is obscure, not darkness. And if you change the meaning of the word to obscure, or obscurity, in this verse, from darkness, the verse reads very different. And could mean something very different as well. And that would be the end of the discussion, except for the fact that the word obscure originally meant to be darkened. It was used metaphorically to describe the condition of not being known. But the actual meaning of the word obscure meant to be in the dark, as you see from the etymology of the word on your screen. So while the meaning of the word skato means obscure, it can also mean darkness. But the problem is that darkness is not what the word means. In fact, the word skato still exists in modern Greek. But if you put this word into Google Translate to translate it from modern Greek, it will give you the meaning of to kill. Neither obscure or darken. And certainly, kill is entirely another meaning altogether. So this word has had an evolution of definitions. And to make matters more ambiguous, if you do an electronic search on the term in the New Testament, you will discover this is the only place it occurs. There is no other instance of it anywhere in the New Testament. The root word of skato is skotos. And skotos is used 32 times throughout the New Testament. It is a very common word and does in fact mean darkness. And if you look up the definition of skotos in modern Greek, you are going to find it has a very certain singular definition, meaning darkness. The problem is, however, that skato does not have the same meaning. It has a related meaning, but seems to be used to imply things related to darkness, but is not itself darkness. Just as it is used in modern Greek today to mean to kill. As in the metaphor, which is used in English, to put out someone's lights, And John's wording is going to get even more mysterious when we come to the last word correction at the end of the verse. But the next correction is the Greek word masome, which is translated as gnaw, but means to chew. That is a fairly minor correction, as gnaw and chew are pretty close in terms of their meaning. But the word means to chew. So we will go ahead and make that correction here, anyway. This is a small correction, but could prove important. Chew is something you do when you eat food. But gnaw is something you might do as a result of physical pain. So there is a difference in the shades of meaning. The problem with this section of verse is that it is pretty clear John is making use of an expression of speech. Kind of like we have the modern expression of having to bite your tongue or hold your tongue. And while we know our expression of bite your tongue or hold your tongue means to keep silent when you want to say something, we do not really know what the expression chew your tongue, as you do when you eat food, meant to people in 95 AD. But it implies poverty or lack from the language. In other words, you are so poor, the only thing you have to eat is to chew on your own tongue for your dinner. If that is the right way to understand this expression, it would be a figure of speech to illustrate being in extreme need. However, whatever definition we ascribe to it today will be speculative only, unless some archaeologist digs something up that explains it. But if you don't even have the actual words of the expression John used, we might not recognize that an archaeologist even found something that related to it, even if they did find something. So we will correct this back to the word chew rather than gnaw. And the last correction brings us back to the mystery of the term scuto, translated as darkness, but means obscure, mentioned previously. This verse presents a mystery. When you read the text in English, you see darkness, and then you see John saying they gnaw their tongue because of pain. But then you find out the word darkness doesn't really mean darkness. And darkness doesn't really inflict any physical pain. So why would anyone be gnawing their tongue because of pain? Unless they have disease that causes blindness. Then physical pain would naturally be expected to be part of that experience. So the fact that darkness actually means obscurity or blindness, not darkness, then a physical plague of disease that causes blindness would make sense to also cause physical pain. But then you discover the word is not gnaw, as you would do in pain, but chew, as in what you do when you eat food. And that brings us to our last correction, which is where this all gets complicated. The last correction is the Greek word ponos, and is translated into English as the word pain. The only problem is that this word ponos, while it does mean pain in a certain sense, it is not the kind of pain that is physical pain from an injury or a disease. It is the kind of pain that comes from emotional pain. You see in the lexicon the word anguish, but its primary meaning is toil. So how does toil and anguish and pain all connect in this text? The reason the word toil is important in retaining in the translation is because the word toil implied the kind of pain caused by lack. It was the kind of pain associated with poverty. To be greatly in need. In fact, when you look the word pain up in the New Testament, outside of this occurrence in Revelation, you will discover there are 3 other mentions of physical pain. The first occurrence is Acts 2:24, which uses the Greek word odin. The second occurrence is Romans 8:22, and uses the Greek word sunodino, and the third occurrence is Revelation 12:2, and uses the Greek word basanidzo. So, there is no other occurrence of this term in the New Testament. And it is never used to refer to physical pain by any other author. To further illustrate that the kind of pain John is describing is emotional pain, or anguish, from a lack or need, the root word of ponos is the word penes, and as you see on your screen, it means to toil for daily sustenance, starving, indigent, and poor. So the kind of pain John is prophesying is not physical pain, but the pain of anguish and sorrow, because of a lack or need. Something very important is missing, which is making life very difficult and hard. So, once again, we need to restore the original meaning of the term, which is toil, not pain. After we make these corrections, our retranslation reads as follows, quote, "And the 5th messenger poured out his saucer upon the throne of the beast. and his kingdom was obscured, and they chewed their tongues, from toil." End quote. Now, we have the implication of what kind of pain John is prophesying. It is the kind of pain, or anguish, brought from toil. Not from a disease or physical wound, but from a lack or need. And that clue makes a huge difference in how verse 10 must be understood. That is why finding these original meanings are so important. Unfortunately, we have run out of time in this video, and we are halfway through the chapter, in verse 10. This is a long chapter, and contains 21 verses, which means we are going to have to finish this translation in the next video. In the 10 verses we covered in this video, we looked at 260 words, in the King James Version, and found that 45 of them needed substantial changes, either in the form of outright lexicon corrections, or improvements or clarifications. And that a full 50% of our verses, in the textual examination, were substantially affected, in the way that they read. What this demonstrates, is that if you think you can open a King James Bible, and read the prophecies in Revelation, in English, and think you are accurately reading what John actually prophesied, you are mistaken. You cannot possibly understand John's prophecies, without engaging in an examination of the underlying, original Greek language. Which is rarely done by counter-Reformation eschatology preachers and teachers. When they cite the English texts to make their critical points, half the time, it's not even there, the way they are citing the text in English. But they haven't even gone through the trouble to examine it in the original Greek manuscript language. Because they are either lazy or dishonest. And you saw that in looking directly at the Greek text, many of the common ideas about the bowl or saucer judgments that are commonly propagated are simply contradicted by these texts in Greek. The word translated, all, or every, in English, is the Greek qualitative use of pas, and means all kinds, not English quantitative expression, all, meaning every single one. You saw that the reference to water turning to blood was specified to be in appearance, not substance. You saw that they do not gnaw their tongues, they chew them, and it is not in pain, it is in toil, or need. And it is technically not darkness, but obscurity. These clarifications in the Greek text make a massive difference in the way these texts are read and understood in English. And they are substantial enough to even change what the prophecy actually even means. And that is why we go through what some may consider to be this boring exercise before we exegete the meaning of these texts to understand their prophecies. In the next video, we will complete the translation work for Revelation chapter 16. The retranslation text from our translation work in this video, covering verses 1 through 10, is available in the description section under this video. Don't miss the next video, where we will discover even more surprises concerning Revelation 16, in verses 11 through 21, hidden in the original Greek manuscript language, in the Textus Receptus. Thank you for watching.